Kia ora. Welcome to Campfire Stories. I'm Rose from Christchurch City Libraries, and I'm in the middle of reading Agatha Christie's book, The Moving Finger. It's a Miss Marple story, but we haven't quite come across Miss Marple yet. We have met quite an interesting cast of characters. I wonder if you have a bit of an idea who the person might be who's sending these awful anonymous letters. Anyway, we're up to chapter 4. It was, I think, about a week later that Partridge informed me that Mrs. Baker would like to speak to me for a minute or two if I would be so kind. The name Mrs. Baker conveyed nothing to me at all. "Who is Mrs. Baker?" I said, bewildered. "Can't she see Miss Joanna?" But it appeared that I was the person with whom an interview was desired. It further transpired that Mrs. Baker was the mother of the girl Beatrice. I had forgotten Beatrice. For a fortnight now, I had been conscious of a middle-aged woman with wisps of grey hair, usually on her knees, retreating crab-like from bathroom and stairs and passages when I appeared, and I knew, I suppose, that she was our new daily woman. Otherwise, the Beatrice complication had faded from my mind. I could not very well refuse to see Beatrice's mother, especially as I learned that Joanna was out, but I was, I must confess, a little nervous at the prospect. I sincerely hoped that I was not going to be accused of having trifled with Beatrice's affections. I cursed the mischievous activities of anonymous letter writers to myself, at the same time as, aloud, I commanded that Beatrice's mother should be brought to my presence. Mrs. Baker was a big, broad, weather-beaten woman with a rapid flow of speech. I was relieved to notice no signs of anger or accusation. "I hope, sir," she said, beginning at once when the door had closed behind Partridge, "that you'll excuse the liberty I've taken in coming to see you, but I thought, sir, as you was the proper person to come to, and I should be thankful if you could see your way to telling me what I ought to do in the circumstances, because in my opinion, sir, something ought to be done, and I've never been one to let the grass grow under my feet, and what I say is, no use moaning and groaning, but up and doing, as Vicar said in his sermon only the week before last." I felt slightly bewildered, and as though I had missed something essential in the conversation. "Certainly," I said. "Won't you sit down, Mrs. Baker? I'm sure I shall be glad to help you in any way I can." I paused expectantly. "Thank you, sir." Mrs. Baker sat down on the edge of a chair. "It's very good of you, I'm sure, and glad I am that I came to you. I said to Beatrice, and her howling and crying on her bed, 'Mr. Burton will know what to do,' I said, being a London gentleman, and something must be done, what with young men being so hot-headed and not listening to reason the way they are, and not listening to a word a girl says, and anyway, if it was me, I says to Beatrice, I'd give 'em as good as I got, and what about that girl down at the mill?" I felt more than ever bewildered. "I'm sorry," I said, "but I don't quite understand. What has happened?" "It's the letters, sir. Wicked letters. Indecent, too, using such words and all. Worse than I've seen in the Bible, even." Passing over an interesting sideline here, I said desperately, Has your daughter been having more letters?" "Not her, sir. She's had just the one. That one was as the occasion of her leaving here." "There was absolutely no reason," I began, but Mrs. Baker firmly and respectfully interrupted me. "There is no need to tell me, sir, that what was wrote was all wicked lies. I had Miss Partridge's word for that, and indeed I would have known it for myself. You aren't that type of gentleman, sir, that I well know, and you an invalid and all. Wicked untruthful lies it was, but all the same I says to Beatrice as she'd better leave, because you know what talk is, sir. No smoke without fire, that's what people say, and a girl can't be too careful. And besides, the girl herself felt quite bashful after what had been written, so I says quite right to Beatrice when she said she wasn't coming up here again, though I'm sure we both regretted the inconvenience being such—" Unable to find her way out of the sentence, Mrs. Baker took a deep breath and began again. "And that I hoped would be the end of any nasty talk. But now George, down at the garage, him what Beatrice is going with, he's got one of them, saying awful things about our Beatrice, and how she's going on with Fred Ledbetter's Tom, and I can assure you, sir, the girl has been no more than civil to him, and passing the time of day, so to speak." My head was now reeling under this new complication of Mr. Ledbetter's Tom. "Let me get this straight," I said. "Beatrice's young man has had an anonymous letter making accusations about her and another man?" "That's right, sir, and not nicely put at all. Horrible words used, and it drove young George mad with rage, it did, and he came round and told Beatrice he wasn't going to put up with that sort of thing from her, and he wasn't going to have her go behind his back with other chaps, and she says it's all a lie, and he says no smoke without fire, he says, and rushes off being hot like in his temper, and Beatrice, she took on ever so, poor girl, and I said I'll put my hat on and come straight round to you, sir." Mrs. Baker paused and looked at me expectantly, like a dog waiting for reward after doing a particularly clever trick. "But why come to me?" I demanded. "I understood, sir, that you'd had one of these nasty letters yourself, and I thought, sir, that being a London gentleman, you'd know what to do about them." "If I were you," I said, "I should go to the police. This sort of thing should be stopped." Mrs. Baker looked deeply shocked. "Oh, no, sir, I couldn't go to the police." "Why not?" "I've never been mixed up with the police, sir. None of us ever have." "Probably not. But the police are the only people who can deal with this sort of thing. It's their business." "Go to Bert Rundle?" Bert Rundle was the constable, I knew. "There's a sergeant or an inspector surely at the police station." "Me? Going to the police station?" Mrs. Baker's voice expressed reproach and incredulity. I began to feel annoyed. "That's the only advice I can give you." Mrs. Baker was silent, obviously quite unconvinced. She said wistfully and earnestly, "These letters ought to be stopped, sir. They did ought to be stopped. There'll be mischief done sooner or later." "It seems to me there is mischief done now," I said. "I mean violence, sir. These young fellows, they get violent in their feelings, and so do the older ones." I asked, "Are a good many of these letters going about?" Mrs. Baker nodded. "It's getting worse and worse, sir. Mr. and Mrs. Beadle at the Blue Boar, very happy they've always been, and now these letters comes, and it sets him thinking things that aren't so, sir." I leaned forward. "Mrs. Baker," I said, "have you any idea at all who is writing these abominable letters?" To my great surprise, she nodded her head. "We've got our ideas, sir. Yes, we've all got a very fair idea." "Who is it?" I fancied she might be reluctant to mention a name, but she replied promptly, "'Tis Miss Cleet. That's what we all think, sir. 'Tis Mrs. Cleet for sure." I had heard so many names this morning that I was quite bewildered. I asked, "Who is Mrs. Cleet?" Mrs. Cleet, I discovered, was the wife of an elderly jobbing gardener. She lived in a cottage on the road leading down to the mill. My further questions only brought unsatisfactory answers. Questioned as to why Mrs. Cleet should write these letters, Mrs. Baker would only say vaguely that 'twould be like her. In the end I let her go, reiterating once more my advice to go to the police, advice which I could see Mrs. Baker was not going to act upon. I was left with the impression that I had disappointed her. I thought over what she had said. Vague as the evidence was, I decided that if the village was all agreed that Mrs. Cleet was the culprit, then it was probably true. I decided to go and consult Griffith about the whole thing. Presumably he would know this Cleet woman. If he thought advisable, he or I might suggest to the police that she was at the bottom of this growing annoyance. I timed my arrival for about the moment I fancied Griffith would have finished his surgery. When the last patient had left, I went into the surgery. "Hello, it's you, Burton." "Yes, I want to talk to you." I outlined my conversation with Mrs. Baker and passed on to him the conviction that this Mrs. Cleet was responsible. Rather to my disappointment, Griffith shook his head. "It's not so simple as that," he said. "You don't think this Cleet woman is at the bottom of it?" "She may be, but I should think it most unlikely." "Then why do they think it's her?" He smiled. "Oh," he said, "you don't understand. Mrs. Cleet is the local witch." "Good gracious," I exclaimed. "Yes, sounds rather strange nowadays. Nevertheless, that's what it amounts to. The feeling lingers, that there are certain people, certain families, for instance, whom it isn't wise to offend. Mrs. Cleet comes from a family of wise women, and I'm afraid she's taken pains to cultivate the legend. She's a queer woman with a bitter and sardonic sense of humour. It's been easy enough for her, if a child cuts its finger or had a bad fall or sickened with mumps, to nod her head and say, "Yes, he stole my apples last week," or "he pulled my cat's tail." Soon enough, mothers pulled their children away, and other women brought honey or a cake they'd baked to give to Mrs. Cleet so as to keep on the right side of her, so that she wouldn't ill-wish them. It's superstitious and silly, but it happens. So naturally now, they think she's at the bottom of this. But she isn't. Oh no, she isn't the type. It's not so simple as that. Have you any idea? I looked at him curiously. He shook his head, but his eyes were absent. "No," he said, "I don't know at all. But I don't like it, Burton. Some harm is going to come of this." When I got back to the house, I found Megan sitting on the veranda steps, her chin resting on her knees. She greeted me with her usual lack of ceremony. "Hello," she said. "Do you think I could come to lunch?" "Certainly," I said. "If it's chops or anything difficult like that and they won't go round, just tell me," shouted Megan as I went round to apprise Partridge of the fact that there would be 3 to lunch. I fancy that Partridge sniffed. She certainly managed to convey, without saying a word of any kind, that she didn't think much of that Miss Megan. I went back to the veranda. "Is it quite all right?" asked Megan anxiously. "Quite all right," I said. "Irish stew." "Oh, well, that's rather like dog's dinner anyway, isn't it? I mean, it's mostly potato and flavour." "Quite," I said. I took out my cigarette case and offered it to Megan. She flushed. "How nice of you." "Won't you have one?" "No, I don't think I will, but it was very nice of you to offer it to me, just as though I was a real person." "Aren't you a real person?" I said, amused. Megan shook her head, then, changing the subject, she stretched out a long, dusty leg for my inspection. "I've darned my stockings," she announced proudly. I am not an authority on darning, but it did occur to me that the strange puckered blot of violently contrasting wool was perhaps not quite a success. "It's much more uncomfortable than the whole," said Megan. "It looks as though it might be," I agreed. "Does your sister darn well?" I tried to think if I had ever observed any of Joanna's handiwork in this direction. "I don't know," I had to confess. "Well, what does she do when she gets a hole in her stocking?" "I rather think," I said reluctantly, "that she throws them away and buys another pair." "Very sensible," said Megan, "but I can't do that. I get an allowance now, £40 a year. You can't do much on that." I agreed. "If only I wore black stockings, I could ink my legs," said Megan sadly. "That's what I always did at school. Miss Batworthy, the mistress who looked after our mending, was like her name, blind as a bat. It was awfully useful." "It must have been," I said. We were comfortable while I smoked my pipe. It was quite a companionable silence. Megan broke it by saying suddenly and violently, "I suppose you think I'm awful, like everyone else?" I was so startled that my pipe fell out of my mouth. It was a meerschaum, just colouring nicely, and it broke. I said angrily to Megan, "Now see what you've done." That most uncountable of children, instead of being upset, merely grinned broadly. "I do like you," she said. It was a most warming remark. It is the remark that one fancies, perhaps erroneously, that one's dog would say if he could talk. It occurred to me that Megan, for all she looked like a horse, had the disposition of a dog. She was certainly not quite human. "What did you say before the catastrophe?" I asked, carefully picking up the fragments of my cherished pipe. "I said I supposed you thought me awful," said Megan, but not at all in the same tone she had said before. "Why should I?" Megan said gravely. "Because I am." I said sharply, "Don't be stupid." Megan shook her head. "That's just it. I'm not really stupid. People think I am. They don't know that inside I know just what they're like and that all the time I'm hating them. Hating them? Yes, said Megan. Her eyes, those melancholy, unchildlike eyes, stared straight into mine without blinking. It was a long, mournful gaze. You would hate people if you were like me, she said, if you weren't wanted. Don't you think you're being rather morbid, I asked. Yes, said Megan. That's what people always say when you're saying the truth. And it is true. I'm not wanted, and I can't quite see why. Mummy doesn't like me a bit. I remind her, I think, of my father, who was cruel to her and pretty dreadful from what I can hear. Only mothers can't say they don't want their children and just go away or eat them. Cats eat kittens they don't like. Awfully sensible, I think. No waste or mess. But human mothers have to keep their children and look after them. It hasn't been so bad while I could be sent away to school. But you see, what Mummy would really like is to be just herself and my stepfather and the boys. I said slowly, I still think you're morbid, Megan, but accepting some of what you say is true, why don't you go away and have a life of your own? She gave me an unchildlike smile. You mean take up a career, earn my living? Yes. What at? You could train for something, I suppose, shorthand typing, bookkeeping. I don't believe I could. I am stupid about doing things. And besides, well, she had turned her face away. Now she slowly turned it back again. It was crimson, and there were tears in her eyes. She spoke now with all the childishness back in her voice. Why should I go away and be made to go away? They don't want me, but I'll stay. I'll stay and make everyone sorry. I'll make them all sorry. Hateful pigs. I hate everyone here in Lymstock. They all think I'm stupid and ugly. I'll show them. I'll show them. It was a childish, oddly pathetic rage. I heard a step on the gravel round the corner of the house. Get up, I said savagely. Go into the house through the drawing room. Go up to the first floor of the bathroom, end of the passage. Wash your face, quick. She sprang up awkwardly to her feet and darted through the window as Joanna came round the corner of the house. Gosh, I'm hot, she called out. She sat down beside me and fanned her face with the Tyrolean scarf that had been round her head. Still, I think I'm educating these damned brogues now. I've walked miles. I've learnt one thing. You shouldn't have these fancy holes in your brogues. The gorse prickles go through. Do you know, Jerry, I think we ought to have a dog. So do I said. By the way, Megan is coming to lunch. Is she? Good. You like her? I asked. I think she's a changeling, said Joanna. Something left on a doorstep, you know, while the fairies take the right one away. It's very interesting to meet a changeling. Oh, I must go up and wash. You can't yet, I said. Megan is washing. Oh, she's been foot-slogging too, has she? Joanna took out her mirror and looked at her face long and earnestly. I don't think I like this lipstick, she announced presently. Megan came out through the window. She was composed, moderately clean, and showed no signs of the recent storm. She looked doubtfully at Joanna. Hello, said Joanna, still preoccupied by her face. I'm so glad you've come to lunch. Good gracious, I've got a freckle on my nose. I must do something about it. Freckles are so earnest and Scottish. Partridge came out and said coldly that luncheon was served. Come on, said Joanna, getting up. I'm starving. She put her arm through Megan's and they went into the house together. That's all we've got time for today. Hope you enjoyed that chapter. See you next time.